The Japanese admiral who realized he'd awakened a sleeping giant, December 7, 1941. The sun had barely begun to rise over Pearl Harbor, painting the harbor waters with a pale golden shimmer that betrayed no hint of the devastation about to unfold. In the quiet hours before the roar, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the flight deck of the Akagi, the morning breeze carrying the sharp tang of salt and oil. His dark eyes, framed by the stiff collar of his uniform, scanned the orderly decks below, where sailors polished the deck and checked the readiness of Mitsubishi A6M0s and Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers. Every man moved with precise, rehearsed efficiency, oblivious to the storm that would soon erupt from the sky. Yamamoto's hand rested lightly on the polished wooden rail, his mind far above the bright Hawaiian dawn. He was a strategist, a man shaped by the lessons of the Russo-Japanese War and by countless nights poring over naval maps in Tokyo. He had orchestrated this operation with meticulous care, the carriers positioned just beyond the horizon, planes fueled and armed to the teeth, a meticulously timed strike designed to paralyze the American Pacific Fleet. And yet, beneath the veneer of confidence, a shadow of unease gnawed at him. The first sign of movement came as distant specks on the horizon, barely visible, yet moving with uncanny precision. The carriers were in position, the strike wave waiting for Yamamoto's signal, and the roar of engines would soon fill the air. You could almost feel the tension vibrating through the decks, sailors gripping their railings, planes shivering in the light morning wind, the hum of anticipation as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. Yamamoto inhaled, his thoughts not on victory, but on the consequences, the meticulous calculation, the choreography of destruction. He knew this strike was bold, brilliantly executed, but he also knew its danger, the risk of awakening a sleeping giant. Hours later, as the first planes roared off the deck and climbed into the pink-tinged sky, the calm Hawaiian morning shattered. Below, the harbor stirred with life, oblivious to the precise storm overhead. American sailors were just pouring their morning coffee, laughing over cigarettes, unaware of the death descending from above. The Zeros sliced through the air, torpedo bombers weaving into position, and bombs began to rain upon the anchored battleships. Explosions erupted with deafening clarity, water and fire mixing in a chaotic ballet. Yamamoto, in his command cabin, remained seated, his expression unreadable, though his mind raced. He had given the order, seen the outcome, yet he was already calculating the ripple effects. He knew the Japanese public would cheer, the emperor would celebrate. But deep in his soul, he recognized the fragile balance of power he had disrupted. America was powerful, vast, industrial, and most importantly, resilient. This strike, for all its brilliance, was not an end. It was a spark that, once ignited, would light a fire that even Japan could not contain. In whispered conversations later, away from the prying eyes of his officers, Yamamoto confided his dread. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of premonition. The sailors below scrambled. Fires licked the hulls of battleships and smoke coiled skyward in black serpentine towers. The deafening staccato of anti-aircraft fire filled the air. But Yamamoto's thoughts were elsewhere. On the months and years ahead, on the factories that would churn endless steel and engines, on the fleets that could rise faster than Japan could strike. He had orchestrated a perfect tactical victory, yet tactically perfect often masks strategic peril. As the last waves of aircraft returned to the carriers, the realization crystallized. The United States, far from cowed, would respond, and in ways Japan could scarcely imagine. In the following days, reports from reconnaissance and returning pilots filled Yamamoto's cabin. Damage assessments were grimly satisfying. Battleships sunk, aircraft destroyed, and morale shaken. Yet amid the tactical triumph, Yamamoto could not shake the vision of American resolve solidifying, of factories running day and night, of a nation fueled not just by steel, but by outrage. Each ship sunk and plane lost to the Americans only seemed to deepen his premonition. Victory, he understood, was ephemeral. Awakening the industrial titan of the Pacific would carry consequences no one could fully foresee. December 8, 1941. The day after the attack, Pearl Harbor smoldered beneath a morning fog, tinged with smoke and the metallic scent of burned fuel. Across the Pacific, news traveled like a wildfire. The Americans had been struck hard, their pride wounded, their naval might temporarily crippled. Yet in Tokyo, Yamamoto sat in his office, surrounded by maps, dispatches, and aides scurrying with reports. The flickering lanterns cast long shadows across his furrowed brow, illuminating a face etched with both duty and dread. He understood the exhilaration of victory, yet his thoughts were elsewhere, already calculating the enemy's next moves. In his mind, he replayed the attack repeatedly, torpedoes arcing through the water, bombs ripping through the decks of the Arizona and Oklahoma, Zeros darting across the skies in perfect formation. He allowed himself a moment of pride, yet even in the glow of success, a gnawing anxiety remained. Yamamoto knew America's strength was not just in ships or pilots. It was in factories, in men and women who could turn raw materials into tanks, planes, and ammunition with relentless speed. The US had barely been touched in the broader sense. He had struck the fleet, yes, but the giant beneath the surface, the giant of industry, production, and determination, remained alive and looming. Later, he convened a small meeting with senior officers, his voice calm yet heavy with foreboding. "This operation," he began, "is only the beginning. It is brilliant, yes, but temporary. Do not mistake our success for the destruction of our enemy." His officers nodded, some in awe of the tactical genius displayed, others in blind jubilation. Yamamoto's eyes scanned the maps on the wall, tracing the American coastlines, the sprawling cities, the factories that churned day and night. He could almost see the assembly lines whirring, the furnaces burning, and the workers assembling war machines faster than any fleet Japan could muster. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Americans were awakening, not to despair, but to fury and resolve. President Roosevelt, speaking to Congress, coined the phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," igniting the American people's collective outrage. Newspapers across the country published photographs of the destruction, fueling anger, patriotism, and a willingness to mobilize every resource. For Yamamoto, the warning signs were clear. The tactical success of Pearl Harbor had stirred a sleeping giant, one whose retaliation would be measured not just in fleets and planes, but in decades of relentless production and manpower. In private, Yamamoto confided his fears to aides and confidants. He understood the long-term implications of striking first. The Japanese Navy had achieved brilliance, a stunning blow to the Pacific Fleet. But the strategic picture was shifting ominously. The United States, vast and resource-rich, would not simply rebuild, it would overwhelm. Factories would produce steel and engines at unprecedented rates. Pilots and sailors would train in the thousands, and the American spirit, wounded but unbroken, would forge a response that no initial tactical victory could prevent. Even as Yamamoto planned the next phase of operations, expansions into the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, he carried the weight of that haunting prediction. He foresaw that the US, enraged and mobilized, would not merely react, but innovate. Aircraft carriers would become the backbone of naval power, submarine warfare would intensify, and industrial ingenuity would reshape the very nature of conflict. He had ignited a fire he could not control, a giant that would rise in fury, determination, and scale beyond anything Japan could anticipate. The contrast between temporary triumph and looming disaster became a silent torment. Each report from reconnaissance planes, each intercepted communication, each assessment of fuel and troop production reminded Yamamoto of the truth he could not ignore. The US was enormous, resilient, and far from defeated. In quiet moments, he would stare at maps of the Pacific, imagining the slow but inevitable encroachment of American forces. Even as his strategies unfolded with precision, he understood the danger of underestimating a nation fueled not merely by fear but by righteous anger and industrial might. Early 1942. The Pacific was a vast chessboard of islands, shipping lanes, and harbors, each move watched, calculated, and countered. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the flagship Nagato during a fleet briefing, reviewed the latest intelligence reports with meticulous care. Maps sprawled across the cabin table, dotted with pins marking Japanese advances and US responses. He traced the movements of carriers, supply convoys, and troop transports, his eyes lingering on the growing presence of American forces along the Pacific Rim. Every intercepted message, every reconnaissance report confirmed the terrifying truth. The giant had awakened. From the Aleutians to the Coral Sea, American ships moved with deliberate precision. Aircraft carriers, once stationary targets, now launched strikes hundreds of miles away from bases, demonstrating flexibility Yamamoto had anticipated but underestimated in scale. Factories in California, Michigan, and New York churned endlessly, delivering planes, tanks, and naval guns faster than Japan could capture or destroy. Each report reminded him of his earlier warning. Tactical brilliance could only achieve so much. Strategic supremacy belonged to those with unmatched industrial capacity and national resolve. He felt the weight of his own words. They were no longer prophecy. They were reality. Yamamoto's personal torment deepened as he observed the first major confrontations. The Battle of Midway loomed on the horizon, a critical test of Japanese naval superiority. He had planned meticulously, hoping to cripple the American carrier fleet in a single strike. But even as he coordinated his attack, he sensed the resilience on the other side. Intelligence had underestimated the Americans' capacity for code-breaking and rapid response. The carefully orchestrated plan that had delivered Pearl Harbor's shock now risked becoming a trap. For the first time, Yamamoto confronted the chilling notion that his tactical genius might not suffice against the overwhelming force of an industrialized enemy awakened and enraged. By mid-1942, the United States counteroffensive became undeniable. The Doolittle Raid, a symbolic strike over Tokyo, demonstrated that American planes could reach the Japanese homeland. Though minor in material damage, it pierced the illusion of invulnerability and rattled the command. Yamamoto, witnessing the effects, recognized the psychological dimension of warfare he had perhaps underestimated. The giant was not only awake, it was learning, adapting, and striking in ways Japan had never imagined. In confidential discussions with his staff, Yamamoto reiterated the haunting premonition he had voiced months earlier. "We may have achieved temporary success," he admitted, "but the United States will not rest. Its power, its capacity to endure and rebuild is far beyond our estimation. What we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." His words were somber, the kind of declaration that reverberates through strategy rooms and history alike. Yet even with foresight, he remained committed to Japan's expansion, navigating between the pressing demands of empire and the looming threat of an enemy mobilizing at a scale no single fleet could match. As the war stretched on, Yamamoto's prediction proved tragically accurate. The US Navy rebuilt, new fleets entered the Pacific, and relentless waves of American bombers and aircraft carriers began to roll back Japanese gains. Yamamoto's concern for the industrial giant's response was realized in the form of island-hopping campaigns, massive production of ships and planes, and a national resolve that refused compromise. By the time Midway ended in disaster for the Japanese fleet, the pattern was clear. Tactical victories could no longer dictate the course of the war. Strategic endurance, fueled by the awakened giant's might, would determine the outcome. Even in his final months, Yamamoto carried this burden with grim awareness. His brilliance as a strategist had orchestrated one of history's most audacious attacks, yet it had also unleashed a force beyond calculation. The sleeping giant, once roused, would not sleep again. It would retaliate, innovate, and overwhelm. For Japan, the consequences were irreversible. And for history, Yamamoto's haunting warning remained. Sometimes, the greatest victories carry the seeds of inevitable defeat.